Let's see. Hi, everyone, and obviously it's Johns Hopkins Medicine time in Palm Beach. And as you know, we've been at this. Nancy and I were counting the years. We think it's over 27 years. And of course, this is the Dean's Symposium, a very special afternoon. And the whole purpose is to bring you all together to kind of share with you what's going on in Johns Hopkins Medicine, the new programs, scientific discoveries. But today's session is a little different, as you'll find out. It has an extraordinary human touch to it. So there are many trustees here, former trustees of the university, Johns Hopkins Medicine, hospitals in Washington, Florida. Would all those trustees, former trustees, please stand so we can say thank you to you? I also have the special pleasure today of introducing our president. Ron Daniels has been president for, well, is now in his 9th year, and he is the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University. That is an applause which is very well received, because I have been a trustee for 45 years. I have never seen Johns Hopkins University in better shape. And I mean that most sincerely. There's a pulsation, a vibrancy to the university, and it's throughout all divisions, and that's what's most important. It is very, very broad-based. Ron is the guy, he sets the pace, he sets the tone, and it is very, very successful. So our good friends, I want to introduce to you today our president of the Johns Hopkins University, Mr. Ron Daniels.
Well, good afternoon, and of course, Morris, thank you so much for that all too kind introduction, but of course, for all that you do for Johns Hopkins. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, indeed with all of you. Each year, our goal at this symposium is to give you a sense of the extraordinary work that is underway at Johns Hopkins Medicine. And it's not easy because our time is limited, and yet there's so many extraordinary things that we want to showcase to you. So one of the hardest things for us to do is to figure out precisely what are the small subset of things that we want to focus upon. And this year, we've got cognitive function and neuroscience on the brain, and for good reason. Chronic diseases that affect brain function are among our greatest challenges. Each year, 15 million people worldwide are affected by stroke. The numbers for those suffering from Alzheimer's are equally stark, more than 5 million people in the United States alone. And the impact on families and caregivers is incalculable, and the burden of long-term care, just in economic terms, immense. A challenge of this magnitude, with outcomes that are as yet uncertain, might deter an individual or an institution from tackling them with zeal. But as Morris gave you some sense a moment ago, and as he has in past years when he's introduced the symposium, that's just not in Hopkins' DNA. Rather than a barrier, those kinds of numbers are simply a call to action, and they always have been. Consider this. At the close of the 19th century, through the early decades of the 20th century, neurology was a newly minted discipline. Neurosurgery, at best, an imperfect art. Enter Hopkins pioneering neurosurgeon Walter Dandy, whose techniques revolutionized surgical treatment of cancer and other disorders of the brain. Belying his name, Dandy was not, in truth, a light-hearted soul, but rather someone known for his prodigious work ethic. At his peak, he performed over 1,000 complex neurosurgeries each year, nearly 3 per day, supported by a small cadre of exceptional colleagues known as the Brain Team, which included, I'm delighted to say, our great friend and Hopkins alum, Dr. Irving Sherman, who just came in a few moments ago, and I'm just wondering, Irving, if you could just, there he is at the back, just if you could just wave so we can acknowledge your role. Yet more striking than the sheer numbers of surgeries performed by Dandy was his persistence in the face of truly daunting odds of survival for his patients. As the Baltimore Sun put it, Dandy's work consisted of cases so difficult that lesser men were unwilling to undertake them. Yet it is from such cases that the art of surgery makes its greatest advances. Dr. Dandy, the reporter, wrote, lived his professional life among suffering. He understood it. He understood it, and it galvanized him to give patients hope. That unique amalgam of courage, compassion, and persistence in pursuit of excellence remains the essence of Johns Hopkins Medicine. And it continues to drive all that we have done ever since we were last here together in Florida. It fuels our ongoing fight against cancer, as our researchers have recently developed a single non-invasive blood test that screens for 8 common types of cancer, cancers that account for more than 60% of all cancer deaths in the United States. Just imagine that kind of early prediction, which gives hope to early intervention with far less draconian therapies, is again something that truly will revolutionize cancer care. It inspires the work of our clinician scientists at the Bloomberg Kimmel Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, who have recently secured FDA approval to make immunotherapy the first, not the second, but the first line of defense in the treatment of lung cancer. And it was abundantly evident last week as we gathered in New York to launch the Sheikh Khalifa Stroke Institute, our commitment to charting a new course in stroke care and treatment. One that builds on our pioneering work in neuroscience and surgery, one that harnesses the talents not only of neurologists like Justin MacArthur, from whom you'll hear from later today, but also computer scientists, engineers, and public health experts. A collaborative team that is already translating the basic science of stroke into cutting-edge treatments, from preventative approaches to improve the lives of populations, to specially designed video games that engage stroke patients' brains and bodies to dramatically improve rehab outcomes. Now, I can't help but wonder about Walter Dandy's response to the gamification of stroke care. But I can easily imagine how he would have marveled at the vast troves of data that have already transformed how we treat individual patients and improve the health of entire populations. And I'd like to believe that he would have wholeheartedly approved not only of the surgical breakthroughs we have achieved, but the elegant, non-invasive alternatives to surgery, approaches that allow us to experiment, to test, and to dream, as Dr. Dandy did, in ways that prove boundless hope for our patients and ensure that they live fulfilling, healthy lives. Now, of course, we're fortunate to have with us here today Dr. Paul Rothman, who is leading Johns Hopkins Medicine at this extraordinary time in academic medicine and healthcare. Paul, as I have said to you in the past, is the consummate clinician scientist. He is an unfailing champion of research that ignites discovery and creates new models of clinical care, always with our patients and their families in mind. But more than that, he is a mensch. He is just a good soul that brings his humanity and decency to all that is Johns Hopkins Medicine. I'm really lucky, I think we're really lucky to have him at the helm of Johns Hopkins Medicine at this point in time. And I invite Paul to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. You know, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but never a mensch. So this is a new stage in my career. Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming today to hear a little bit about some of the work going on at Hopkins, and to hear what I think you're going to love is a really, really special program today. what I thought I'd do today first is tell you a little bit about Hopkins Medicine and things we're doing now that I think are really special. So, Johns Hopkins Medicine began in 1889 with the founding of Johns Hopkins Hospital, and really now for over 127 years, we've been the top hospital and health system in the world. And it began with these four gentlemen, the four doctors. Everyone should know them: Halstead, Osler, Kelly, and Welsh. And these are the people you know about, because if you had to ask who began Hopkins, it'd be these four gentlemen. And it really, with them, and a vision for what medicine and medical research and education could be that we began. But the honest truth was that if it wasn't for a woman, we wouldn't be who we are today. And that woman is Mary Elizabeth Garrett. For those who don't know, when Mr. Hopkins gave his gift, he actually didn't give enough money for the medical school. And it was Mary Elizabeth Garrett who stood up and actually funded the School of Medicine at Johns Hopkins, but she would only give the money if we admitted women on the same criteria as men, right? So, of course, at the time, the president of the university had much more trepidation than our president now would have had, but eventually he did accept the gift. And ever since then, we have been the top medical center in the world, and it really was Mary Elizabeth Garrett. So if you do the math, that was in 1893, do the math, it's 125 years. And so we're going to celebrate our 125 years of the School of Medicine this year. The first thing, we have a series of events over the year. The first event actually was last month when we renamed the boardroom in the School of Medicine the Mary Elizabeth Garrett Boardroom. Her portrait is now up there with 13 white old men. And I will be the 14th at some point. But Mary Elizabeth Garrett looks over us all, and we're so proud that we did that. The rest of the year, we'll have a series of things, and we're hoping some people in the audience might partake in some of this. We're going to have 125 social events throughout the country, and if any, I know there are some alum in the audience. If you want to participate, that would be terrific. So it is, 125 years of excellence. And the reason Hopkins continues to be great is that people come to Baltimore and to Johns Hopkins because they know if they come to Baltimore, they will make an impact. So for those who don't know, Ron Peterson was the president of the health system for 22 years, retired this year. And so we did a national search and was able to recruit Kevin Sowers to become the new president of the health system. The headhunter said he won't look at any other job in the whole country other than Hopkins. So Kevin came, he's really interesting. He's an oncology nurse. So he's also the first nurse to ever run the Hopkins health system. He just joined us. He's a great addition to the organization. So I talk a little bit about some of the unique research and clinical care going on. I know, as Ron said, we don't have enough time to talk about anything. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. And this one, I think, is out of this world. So it ends up that it really is advantageous for some children who have defects to get those defects fixed in utero before they're born. We now have a fetal surgery program that actually does now 3 different surgeries in utero on babies. It's run by Dr. Bashat, who's here, and I'll just tell you one of those surgeries. So it ends up, there's a condition where the diaphragm, right, the diaphragm is what separates the intestines, the stomach from the lung, isn't fully formed. And when that happens in utero, the intestines end up going in where the lungs should be, and the lungs don't form. Then the babies get born, and they have really malformed lungs. So what Dr. Bashat and his colleagues are doing is sticking a scope into the uterus, putting a balloon down the esophagus, blowing it up to occlude that hole, and keeping the intestines in the intestines so the baby can get born with formed lungs. It's amazing. Just one of the surgeries they're now doing. And actually, I know Henry Brem's here from neurosurgery. They're doing spina bifida surgery in utero now on these kids. It's really amazing things. Another thing we really focus on precision medicine, That's a program we have to ensure that every single person treated at Hopkins eventually will have their care dictated by very specific measurements that it's only true in that patient. We're doing a lot of these. We're focused on diseases. They're called Precision Medicine Centers of Excellence. I'll just tell you one, and that has to do with our Prostate Cancer Center of Excellence. And so what we've been able to do is build an IT platform. So you guys know what the cloud is? Do you guys know what data lakes are? So data lake is in the cloud. I don't know what it's doing in the cloud, but basically it's in the cloud, and we can put all this data or electronic medical record and all these different measurements up there and have our researchers be able to investigate it. It's a great collaboration between the Applied Physics Lab, our engineering school, and the School of Medicine. So for prostate cancer, now if you walk in, what we'll be able to do is have this graph as demonstrated here, which we'll have all your biopsies, all your PSAs, and what Bal Cardinet's group can say is, for you today, you have a 7% chance of progressing to a worse form of prostate cancer. That's specific information, and it all has to do with that patient, what their biopsies, what their genome shows, and what their PSAs show. So it's a new way to treat patients. Really, everyone will really know what their goals are and what their prognosis is. Finally, one other last thing in cancer that's, I think, really phenomenal, and this is a paper by Bert Vogelstein and Christian Tomasetti. Again, a great collaboration between engineering and medicine. So the question they address is cancer random, or is it caused by mutations? And what they did was they looked at all the mutations that occur in different cancers. They looked at the replication rate of different tissues. And what they suggested on, depending on the type of cancer, it might be caused predominantly by mutations or not. So for example, if you have a brain tumor, there's a 95% chance that that occurred randomly. It's just random bad luck. In contrast, if you have lung cancer, it's probably 65% chance that it occurred because of mutations from cigarette smoking or other environmental. And they can do that now for a whole variety of cancers to determine what cancers are just random bad luck. Just a mutation occurred as your DNA was replicating normally, or if it was caused by the environment, by mutagens in the environment. So it's a really great paper. It's in Science. Finally, I get something really innovative in education. So for all of you know, one of probably the major problem we have in medicine now is the cost that medical care has in the US budget, 17 to 18% of GDP. And so one of the things we want to do is produce students that understand that what they need to do is provide care that is not only high quality, but less costly if at all possible. So we're trying to teach our students, do the right tests, but not every test. And so what we do is during their medicine rotation, we have computer programs set up, and we give them patients, and we ask them, what tests would you order for that patient? And then on the computer starts adding up the costs of the test. And so they actually figure out how much the tests would cost, and they would compare them to all the other medical students in the med school and tell them, you know, that same other med students did the same thing, but with a lot cheaper than you did it. It's just a new way to teach people to be more efficient. The other thing we're trying to do is enhance the wellness of our physicians. For those of you who don't know, 54% of physicians in this country are burned out. 54% of physicians in this country feel burned out at any one time. If you look at it, it actually begins in medical school. So burnout begins actually second to third year of medical school where they start to feel burned out. So we think we have to teach our students to take care of themselves. And so we're starting to do this whole wellness program. So students can go to any gym they want for free. We have Tai Chi and yoga in the morning for them. This is the yoga class outside my office. So it's this whole idea to try to get people to take care of themselves, develop a work-life balance so that when they get to my age, they're not burned out. Maybe even younger, they're not burned out. So thanks for joining today. We have a spectacular program, and I'd like Kostas Liketsis to come up now. Kostas is the head of our Bayview Psychiatry Department. He's really one of the leaders in Alzheimer's research in the country, and he's going to lead the discussion today. Kostas Liketsis.
Thank you, Dr. Rothman and President Daniels. It really is a pleasure to be here in Palm Beach. It's been a lovely day, actually, thinking back of what it would be like if we were still in Baltimore today. Happy to be here. So, in fact, as Mr. Offit pointed out, this is going to have a very special face on it today because we're privileged to be joined by two of my patients, and I will introduce them in a moment. But the goal today is to focus on one condition, Alzheimer's disease, and to talk about it from several perspectives. So I will be making a few introductory remarks just to frame some of the issues. I will then invite on the stage after introduction Mr. and Mrs. John and Barbara Alden, and I'll tell you a bit about them. And I will interview them, and they will tell us what it's like to live with Alzheimer's disease. We then have the pleasure of a panel of several colleagues of mine that will be moderated by Mr. Charlie Sheeler, who I will be introducing in a moment. So that's pretty much the agenda at this point. So Alzheimer's is the most common brain degenerative disease of later life. It is common right now to the point that all over the world, about 50 million people have Alzheimer's disease. And because the population around the world is aging, that number will double every 20 years. So if you do the math, in 2050, that number becomes about 110 million if nothing changes. And you have to appreciate that the average person lives for about 10 years, and their care over those 10 years influences at least two other people, typically one or two primary caregivers. So that 100 million number is really intensively affects 300 million people who have to deal with this disease for 10 years. In that sense, it is quite a devastating condition. In the United States, Alzheimer's costs our society about $300 billion every year. It is the single most costly condition that we deal with right now. And those numbers could well rise to over $1 trillion per year starting in 2050. So this is truly a public health emergency across the board. Before I move on, I want to very briefly give you a few definitions. The terms that we use are sometimes unclear. So I'm often asked the question, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? I'll just give you a very simple, hopefully clear enough answer. Dementia refers to the symptoms that the patient has. They're having memory trouble and other problems in their cognition to the point that they can't anymore function independently. That's it. That's what dementia is. You don't need an MRI. You don't need any tests other than a really good doctor to diagnose whether or not you have dementia. Dementia is always caused by a brain condition. Alzheimer's disease is in the brain, and it's the most common brain condition that causes dementia. That's the relationship. Dementia is what the patient has and experiences. Alzheimer's is what is usually causing it by damaging the brain. There are many other causes of dementia, but there are also situations where dementia is not caused by Alzheimer's, but there are many other brain diseases such as Parkinson's, ALS, and so forth that might be the cause. Now, we will, I'm sure, today spend a fair bit of time talking about finding a cure, and that obviously is on our agenda. And I think Hopkins is in most ways at the forefront of trying to find a cure, working collaboratively with colleagues all over the world. But we pride ourselves, and this is, for me, one of the reasons Hopkins is where it is, on care excellence as well. We look for a cure, but we also appreciate that right now the care of our patients is a major priority. And so from the care point of view in the Alzheimer area, we're actually doing reasonably well, even though we don't have a cure. We're fairly good at making an accurate diagnosis. It used to be that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's was entirely a rule out, that we had to evaluate patients, do a number of tests, and conclude that if there was no other cause, it was Alzheimer's disease. We now are starting to have a number of diagnostic tests in the form of blood tests or especially PET scans that can confirm and rule in Alzheimer's disease. So we can bring the clinical accuracy up into the mid-90%, whereas in the past we had to fully wait until after a patient died to be 100% accurate. As well, and we, I think, in many ways at Hopkins lead the way, are showing that currently, if we put together a care program for individual patients, that we can really make a difference over the 10-year course of their illness. that we can help them live at home longer, we can improve their life quality, and we can make things a whole lot better for the caregivers who are taking care of them. So even though we're searching for a cure, our care capacity is reasonably good, which is why we emphasize the importance of detection and diagnosis as early as possible. So what are the major advances that we've seen recently? And I'm going to just lay a quick framework because as we come to a Q&A, I think you'll all have the opportunity to ask, and I just wanted to give you some thoughts. The four major developments. The one is what we call biomarkers. These are biological indicators that help us stage Alzheimer's disease. This is a disease that starts in the brain many years before any symptoms happen, and it steadily progresses. We believe it begins with a sticky protein called amyloid, which spreads through the brain, leads to another protein called tau, and then damages, kills brain tissue. So some of the new biomarkers we have, whether they be MRIs or PET scans or analyses of the cerebrospinal fluid, can help us stage the condition reasonably well, even before symptoms develop. So that's one major development that's evolving. The second is that we are quite good now at understanding the pre-symptomatic stage. That refers to this period of time that could be decades before any symptoms occur when the disease is unfolding in the brain. Dr. Albert, one of the colleagues who will be on the stage in a few minutes, leads a very large group across the world that is pulling together data to understand this pre-symptomatic period. This is our opportunity for prevention. Just like with breast cancer and other forms of cancer, we'd like to get to cure the brain before any symptoms happen, at which point it might be too late. So that's the second major development, the pre-symptomatic period. The third is our understanding of reserve and resilience. There are people who have fairly high genetic risk for Alzheimer's who live into their 90s and don't really have a hint of having it. Many people die with full Alzheimer pathology in their brain. They've got the disease in their brain. They're very old. They die, have no symptoms. So there clearly are ways through which our brain or our body is able to compensate and be resilient. There's a concept of reserve, which speaks to the idea that we might have the ability to resist Alzheimer's as early as our youth, as we develop. There's evidence now to suggest that reserve builds up partly because we chose the right parents, which of course we all did, meaning there's a big genetic influence, but also because of the background and education we have. And maintaining reserve and resilience is an important thing that we can do throughout our life through mental engagement, physical and social engagement. So we can build reserve early in life, maintain and strengthen our reserve through fairly straightforward lifestyle activities, we believe. So reserve, resilience is the third area. And the final area is the appreciation that Alzheimer's is probably not a single disease, the way we appreciated many decades ago that cancer is not a single disease. So that we need to apply the ideas of precision medicine to Alzheimer's and start breaking down the different types. And I'll just give you two examples. At the one extreme are individuals who carry a gene that determines that they will get Alzheimer's if they live long enough. These are all genes that have to do with that sticky substance I mentioned before called amyloid. So if you inherit one of those genes, you will get Alzheimer's. About 5 or 10% of people who get Alzheimer's are in that category. So in that case, amyloid is huge. It's the centerpiece. But a lot of people die at a fairly ripe old age, and they have a lot of amyloid in their brain, but they don't have dementia, or they get dementia because of all kinds of other things around them. So at the other extreme, some forms of dementia that look like our Alzheimer's have much less emphasis on amyloid. So those are the two extremes, and there are probably different kinds of Alzheimer's in between that we need to understand. So that's foundation for the next step. I would like now to introduce John and Barbara Alden. I'll take a moment to say why, and then I'll invite them up. First of all, why did I choose them when Dr. Rothman asked me to think of a patient? Well, I thought it would be nice to really focus on living successfully with Alzheimer's disease and talk a little bit about the sorts of things one has to do in order to do that. So both Mr. and Mrs. Alden are affected by symptoms of this disease at different stages. John and Barbara, as they put it to me, are two kids from rural Illinois who, in John's words, racked up 56 years ago as friends and have been married for 51 years with 2 children, one of whom is here today, Jen, and 7 grandchildren. Barbara was a nurse and also had an MBA and worked in the public health area, but later worked in real estate and as a real estate finance executive, and her family often refers to her as superstar mom. John thinks of himself as an average student, but in fact has a PhD in statistics, is one of those mathematical minds, as you'll experience, that is truly very impressive and well above my pay grade in that regard. They are both retired. They now live in Ginger Cove, a small retirement community outside Annapolis. And for me, they exemplify living with this condition. Barbara has been my patient for many years. She first developed symptoms in 2011, 2012. And John more recently developed symptoms in 2015 and has been diagnosed with a condition called mild cognitive impairment, which is a milder form of memory loss. So without further ado, I'd like to invite John and Barbara Alden to tell us their story. John, Barbara. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you both for coming. This is Redux because we did this yesterday in Naples.
We're pleased and flattered. It's an odd and ironic circumstance to say that, but we have a special relationship with Hopkins, so we feel that however we can help out with star docs and scientists, that's now our role. So just as background, our daughter is here. Her daughter, about a decade ago, was diagnosed with leukemia. And she is the most amazing 12-year-old you could ever want to meet. She's beautiful, bright, and a great athlete. So story number 1. Our son, like Jen in mid-40s, about 20 years ago, was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's. And his doctors are both Hopkins affiliated, one on the faculty and one in practice and adjunct, and he is nearly symptom-free. So we don't have the T-shirt with we're on the team, but we're on the team.
Well, thank you, John and Barbara, for doing this. Maybe I could first ask, what were the first sorts of things that you noticed in Barbara or in yourself that told you something might be wrong?
In the time frame that Costas mentioned, Jen and Greg both talked to me kind of offline at family events and said, seems like Mom's a little forgetful sometimes in the kitchen, or finding it, the right tool, or getting a little bit confused about what the time of when the kids and grandkids were going to arrive for a Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. So as we sort of re-engineered backwards, that's kind of the first set of things we noticed. She also, as a star financial executive, was released from her employment, and when we back-engineered that, it was because there were some forgetful colleague things that diminished her authority, and then she had people running her in her own business.
And so over time, you decided at some point it was important to get help. and you came to us. What got you to make that decision?
Well, the Alzheimer's target was on my back. My mother and one aunt died from it, and so I lived through that and understood in that era. Post-mortem was the first you learned about what mom really had. So I've kind of always thought that was going to be me. And so, being a little bit anal, I connected with a friend who happened to know a board member on the ALZ.org advocacy organization, which I'm sure you all know, and many of you probably support it. That led us then to Bayview, and ultimately the connecting link was there's this guy up there who's like really amazing. You've got to talk to Leketos. So fast forward, we've talked a lot.
No, that's lovely. But what was it that said, look, we've gone from being concerned that this is age-related to we've got to go see doctors for this?
Well, I think because my mother had it, I had some sense of forgetfulness. Didn't sometimes seem just, I slip on a word or something. It was starting to feel more like confusion. So that's one thing. And I think for Barbara, I felt like going early would get us our best shot if there was something going on. And I thought us both going and enrolling in some of the clinical trials at Bayview would then get us introduced to the doctors, to the processes at the Bayview, and get a sort of a database on us. And I think I joked at the last meeting that I think I've been scanned 5 or 6 times. And so my brain is somewhere in brain images are somewhere in a repository. And since I worked at Texas Instruments, I understand the amazing value of the emerging information technology and what can be done. So all it says is get involved, go to the place where you have the best nexus between great science and great clinical care.
Barbara, maybe
I was not paid to say that.
Not yet, at least. Barbara, maybe I could ask you a little bit about what are the sorts of things you noticed with your memory that concerned you?
Well, I think my memory wasn't as good as it had been, and I wasn't sure what that meant. And so I sort of tried to figure it out, and I hadn't figured it out. So now I figured it out, and that I do have Alzheimer's.
And tell us about that. How does that affect you, that knowledge?
You know, it really doesn't. I mean, I was a nurse for a long time, and so I understand health and care, et cetera. So I didn't know what it was. I just didn't know what it was. So.
Is it helpful to know what it is?
I'm not sure what it is, to be
Mm-hmm.
truthful. I don't know exactly what it is that I'm missing. So.
You've had a few tearful times, right?
I've had some hard times, yes. But they're going to get better.
There you go. So you all both had diagnostic assessments. What was that process like?
Let's see. The first was, and prompt me on this so I get it right so people here know about this, but it was a baselining study that has been ongoing for quite a long time.
Right, so your first contact with me, I believe, was via email, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you enrolled in our longitudinal study, and that's a study that our patients come every year, they get an assessment, and when you had your baseline, the conclusion was this is more than, and so we suggested you go be seen in the clinic.
And then following that, we started the process of engaging in clinical trials. So the first one, and I remember vividly to this day, Koskas saying to me, well, if you do these PETs, the answer will be, the outcome will be confirmative. So we did them. 3 exams, sponsored by one of the pharmaceuticals. The images were read by, again, another amazing, eminent person in Hopkins, Dr. Wong, I believe. And the answer came back, there's the amyloid and issues sitting out there for us to now readjust.
So the process involved doing some memory testing and then having the PET scan, which confirmed what we didn't want it to confirm. And so now you've been living with this for a number of years. One of the reasons I was delighted you were willing to come here today was to showcase living well with Alzheimer's. Maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about that.
Okay, well, the first thing that when the diagnosis was formal, we started thinking, so there's a progression. So go to the end of what is known about that progression and you're going to need intensive care. It's going to be extraordinarily demanding to family members and partners. So we now live, so we made a decision that we would find a long-term care arrangement. And one of my friends said, why would you go to that place? And I said, because we're all going to be there sooner or later. And our concept, so this is a CCRC, Ginger Cove in Annapolis, is about 300 independent living apartments. We occupy one, and then there's a progression of healthcare. So you then, as you diminish in capabilities, both either physically or cognitively, you then can be moved to assisted living where you just effectively get more surveillance and more services that are not exactly prescribed, but easily available, and you don't have to think about what's in the fridge and that sort of stuff. And then there is a health center, which is essentially kind of, it's almost a hospital-like, respite-like environment where people who get ill on a short-term basis can go there to kind of get either rehabbed or, you know, like post-op surgery circumstances and so on. And then, here's the nice news about Ginger Cove. There's a long-range plan. A building will start in about 2 to 3 years to build an extension of assisted living and a memory care facility. So we now are where we will probably end up. And even with Jen in the room, I want to say that when we had to think about this, we said to ourselves, we don't want our kids to have to wrestle with some of the horrifying, heartbreaking, financially challenging things that we did with our parents.
One of the things I've appreciated about both of you is that even though you've had to give some things up, there are a lot of other things that have come into your life in a positive way. So I've learned from you, Barbara, a new word. It's called clavinova. I think I got it right this time. Tell us a bit about your clavinova and your friend who comes over and the music.
Plays with me? Oh, well, that's, the gentleman, his name is Ron Trevane, and he comes over with his guitar, and I play with my music, my clavinova, which is what the instrument is, called a clavinova. So I
One amendment, it's a Yamaha digital piano that is both a grand piano and an organ, right?
Correct. So he comes and we play together. I play music and he plays his guitar. And so we have a good time.
That's wonderful. Together.
Yeah, we do it
wonderful.
together. It's fun.
So you're traveling a bit less, as I understand it. And tell us a bit about that.
One note on the music, we call it jamming. And
Technical term.
Ron is my age, about to approach 75, and he's been playing guitar all his life. And we enjoy the same kind of music. And so it's been just an amazing new partnership for Barbara. And I sit around and talk with Ron's wife or have a red beverage to keep my neural system going good. So, all right, now back to the question.
See if I can remember. I think it was about traveling.
Oh, travel. Oh, yeah. I think this was the lead up to how we adjusted our life in a more both tactical and strategic way. We've done, I think, and this is the consultant logic and a quantitatively excellent person, is we know we have to de-risk our life. So we've been boat owners for the 50 years of our marriage. We no longer own a boat. We have done a whole variety of trips around parts of the world and certainly our wonderful country. And we are now pretty well pulled in that we're probably not traveling very far except within the region. Address it? Well, how about I get a little humor in on behalf of our son? Our son, Greg, said to me one day when we had finished all our other sort of arrangements, and I said, the only thing left on our plate was we're thinking of a couple of more trips to Broadway, to which Jenny will chuckle but agree, what the hell would you do that for, Dad? What if a train accident occurred? Or what if you get stopped off the station platform? Or what if there's some other precarious circumstance? So we canceled the trips to Broadway.
You have a pretty busy schedule, as I understand it.
8 to 8. Barbara arises a little later than me, but we're both up and going, dressed and active by 8 a.m. And we typically take advantage of exercise facilities at Ginger Cove. We walk extensively, and I gave up my bicycle, so that's a safety condition. We go out quite a lot into Annapolis, which many of you know is quite a lovely little town. And we still have our symphony and our chorale tickets, or subscriptions. We go into the Kennedy Center now and then, to Baltimore Symphony now and then. So we're trying to continue those things, which both we think are neurologically healthy, and part of the reason for that is because it makes us happy.
So Barbara, what are the kinds of things you look forward to these days?
Well, I like visiting our grandchildren, and we like to spend some time with them when they're available, and they're close, so we get to see them a lot.
They have busy schedules too, I
They
guess.
do, yes. Yeah.
So as we're coming down to our last couple minutes together, what are the things in the future that you're thinking about? What are you anticipating and planning?
Well, I mentioned the progression in living circumstances, so that is in good shape. Reducing what we've been doing externally that has any risk character to it. And we're looking at how we eat every day very well. We look at talking about things that are just, I'm a little bit of not as good as Charlie, but I'm a jokester. Raise your hand, Charlie.
We'll all get a feel for Charlie in a moment.
Yeah, later on. I try to work out putting things that make me sad or frightened, I just put them away. So I talk to myself, okay? This is just the way it is, John. So adjust. You've done that before. This is what you have to do.
Barbara, anything to add to that?
Well, my biggest thing that I love is music, and I have a big instrument called the clavinova, and I play a lot of music, and I love it every day.
That is so wonderful. I don't think there's a better way to end our interview than to remember that you love your music.
Right.
Thank you both for doing this. Well, thank you, Barbara and John, again. So this perhaps gives you a feel for what it's like with people who have to live with us every day. Now we're going to move on to the next part of our program today, which will be moderated by our trustee and a friend, Charlie Sheeler, who you already heard introduced.
Thank you, Costas. But before we transition to the next section of the program, we need to acknowledge the uncommon courage and generosity of John and Barbara Alden. It cannot be easy, but they have come in and they have shared some of the most intimate details of their challenges, of their lives, and they have demonstrated how they have adjusted to some of the toughest curveballs that nature can send our way with a grace, a dignity, and I think very obviously with a lot of mutual love and respect. And it is odd to say this to you, but we should all be so lucky. So, thank you so much. But to me, what's most ironic is the fact that in the midst of the challenges they are facing, what are they doing here today? They are trying to help others, help all of us so that we know and we can recognize that if and when that time comes, it's important to get an early diagnosis and early treatment. Letting us know that lives can still be lived in an enriched and an ennobling fashion with them as our shining example. So we are very grateful to how you have helped to rip away the shroud of fear and of ignorance and stigma that surrounds brain disease. And to all of us who have loved ones who suffer from brain diseases, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. So, like the Aldens, our family came to Hopkins because of the suffering of a loved one. I'm Charlie Sheeler, and myself and my wife, Mary Ellen Pease, she let me keep my name when we got married, are members of the advisory board of Johns Hopkins Psychiatry, and we came to that and came to Hopkins because we had a then 4-year-old baby daughter, our youngest daughter, who was suffering. She had been quite precocious, a normal child. She even thought at the tender age of 4 that she was smarter than both of her parents. But then something happened. She started being incredibly scared to death of dirty laundry, of germs that might be on doors, of unclean hands that caused her to wash her hands for hours at a time until they became raw and bleeding. She was very, very lucky to have a wonderful, loving mother who knew something was wrong and got care right away. And that brought us to Hopkins and brought us to invest in research that can make the life of our daughter better. And the life of our daughter has improved. It's not a Disney ending. She has not been miraculously cured. There are some days when she is still very difficult for a father to deal with. But she is now a 1L at the University of Maryland, and perhaps most important, she still thinks she's smarter than her parents. So, we'll now move on to the next phase, and this is going to be questions and answers amongst experts in the field, starting with Kostas Lyketsos, but he will be joined by Dr. Justin MacArthur, Dr. Esther O, and Dr. Marilyn Albert. If you would please join us up on the stage. Thank you very much. So we're going to start with a lightning round. I want each of you to describe Alzheimer's in one word or less.
So Charlie, my word is hope.
Hope.
Widespread.
Opportunity.
Devastation.
So we have 3 optimists and the founder of the Alzheimer's Treatment Center. Dr. MacArthur. There have been 244 compounds tested in 413 clinical trials for Alzheimer's between 2002 and 2012, and yet only one of those over 200 drugs have been approved for treatment. How can we do better?
Well, we clearly need to do better, Charlie, and those statistics are dismal. One FDA-approved drug, as you said, out of several hundred. I like to think of the potential obstacles to developing conclusive, definitive treatments for Alzheimer's with 3 words, what I call the what, the when, and the how. And what I mean by that is, I think we've focused over the last really 2 decades on this sticky protein, amyloid, and drugs that are designed to dissolve or remove amyloid from the brain. And I think the what is the what target should we in fact be going after. And so some of the latest research, and I'll talk perhaps about that later, is really focused on perhaps additional mechanisms that might underlie Alzheimer's. And so the what target is key. The second, and this was alluded to, is really the when. When do we begin treatment? Do we wait until symptoms are moderately advanced or fully advanced, or do we begin treatment in the pre-symptomatic phase before we even have symptoms developed? Then finally, the how. The how is how do we measure the impact of the drugs? And fortunately, the biomarkers, and we'll be hearing much more about those, both the imaging biomarkers and what I call the soluble biomarkers that are based on either blood or spinal fluid, will allow us, I believe, to measure the impact of these drugs much more efficiently and perhaps quickly than we're able to do with clinical scales.
That's very helpful. And maybe we could follow up on that by speaking with Dr. O. We've heard now about biomarkers and their relevance from Dr. MacArthur. Kostas also alluded to that. Can you provide us with some more detail on what these biomarkers are, what they mean, and why we should care about them?
Sure. I would say, so biomarkers or biological markers of the underlying disease state it really has been a game changer. So I will put them in two big categories. So one would be fluid. Fluid would be cerebrospinal fluid and blood. And now we have very sophisticated imaging biomarkers. And one's actually an FDA-approved biomarker that can be ordered by physicians, and that's called amyloid PET scan. And how that's really changed is that I think one of the things that we had talked about was the accuracy of diagnosis. So a trained physician like me who practices in the memory clinic might have about 85 to 90% accuracy in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. And I would like to kind of put it together as a puzzle. So if you have a 1,000-piece puzzle, just by taking history, doing a good exam, and reviewing medications and so on, I can probably put together about 800 pieces of the puzzle. But really to have a clear picture of what's going on, the other 200 pieces come from things like basic blood tests, also MRI and CT scan. But now that we have these biological markers, we're really close to filling the entire puzzle together. And I think really that's been a game changer. I particularly, in my case, study blood biomarkers. So I am looking for less expensive, non-invasive way of detecting basically underlying disease state. Recently, we've actually received a large NIH grant looking at a very simple oral glucose tolerance test. So what we found is that when we administer 75 grams of sugar, and some of you might be familiar with OGTT because a lot of pregnant women actually take the test for gestational diabetes. What we see is that actually the sticky substance called amyloid in the blood, the levels change, and the pattern of change is different between patients who have Alzheimer's disease and those who are normal. And so we're hoping that we can actually develop this further, and hopefully we can use it in clinical trials as well as in clinical practice in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Albert, we hear the use of the phrase use it or lose it a lot. We hear it in the context of Hopkins' personal time off, but we also hear it in the context of continuing to use your brain in the latter stages of your life to keep it sharp. Is there science behind this, using your brain and using it rigorously? Can that help stave off decline?
So there's actually increasing evidence that being mentally active increases the likelihood of maintaining cognitive function as you get older. The best data comes from a study called the ACTIVE study, which you may have heard about. It was conducted in many different places around the country, one of which, of course, was Johns Hopkins. And they did something very interesting. They trained people in different kinds of tasks related to speed, to memory, to reasoning, and they trained them for actually only 6 weeks. And then they followed them. But the reason that this study is so valuable is that they've now followed these people for 10 years. And what they found is that that kind of mental activity that people were engaged in for 6 weeks, compared to people who didn't have that training, has had an impact 10 years later. Now, you won't be surprised to know that they're better on the tests. Of course, if you practice the tests, you'll get better on them. But the really important thing is that the individuals who had this training 10 years later have less difficulty in their daily lives. So that really is the most encouraging evidence that being mentally active, like going to a session about Alzheimer's disease, is possibly beneficial to you many years later.
Thank you, thank you. Costas, you heard President Daniels say that Hopkins has accepted the challenge of trying to find cures or other treatments or improvements in the way that we treat Alzheimer's. We know the Aldens deserve better. We know the 110 million people who may develop this disease in the coming years deserve better. What is the most promising research avenues out there? What's going on?
So Charlie, I think to refer to Justin's comment about all those clinical trials that have been problematic, I think the promising research comes out of learning from those experiences. And I think there are two lessons. The one lesson is that we have used all those medications to treat everybody as if this were one disease. So thinking systematically, who are the people who are likely to benefit from amyloid therapy, all the way to understanding other mechanisms that might be relevant to some people but not others, and using drugs that are relevant to that. A very specific example I'll give you. Many years ago, there was this initial interest in how inflammation was related to the propagation of Alzheimer's throughout the brain. And there were a lot of trials that used anti-inflammatories over the counter and also prednisone to treat Alzheimer's that did not prove successful. We were engaged in using non-steroidal medicines like Aleve or Celebrex, over-the-counter sorts of things, to prevent Alzheimer's in people who didn't have the symptoms, and there was evidence that they didn't work. But in later analyses, and Esther and I have spent a lot of time on this, it seems as though a subgroup of people who were in those studies who have certain characteristics in their blood might respond to nonsteroidals. So that would imply that some people have, if you will, an inflammatory version of Alzheimer's and will have an anti-inflammatory drug. That's an idea still, but it's the kind of idea that puts this forth. So that's the one. Let's get the target of people and the disease right. The second is the modeling of the disease. So all of the medicines that Justin MacArthur mentioned that failed in trials were tested in mice. And we've been extraordinarily successful at curing Alzheimer's in mice for the last 20 or 30 years, but none of these drugs have made it onto the market. So we need new models. We need new models, and I think the most viable, interesting models right now are stem cell models. These are models that come out of my individual blood, that are my own cells, that can be used to model the disease in my brain in a test tube, and then over time develop the capability to get the right drug for me.
Fair enough. Thank you. Justin, let's move on to some of the vascular issues. My GP recently told me that the standards have changed, that my 140/90 no longer cuts it. They keep lowering the recommended blood pressure. I think now it's 130/80. How do these vascular factors play into the development of Alzheimer's?
Sure, Charlie. So thank you for asking that. One of the things I want to emphasize that all of us have said is about the accuracy of diagnosis first, and just to stress, as Costas did in his introduction, that dementia is a symptom. Dementia can reflect many different disease types, including hydrocephalus, including a slow-growing brain tumor, and so it is really critical as we think about dementia and Alzheimer's disease to think about accuracy of diagnosis, and the kind of workups that we heard from Mr. and Mrs. Alden are key. Now, in terms of the blood pressure control, the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association recently lowered the blood pressure guidelines for the US, as you just pointed out. And why is that important? Well, unlike genes, blood pressure is a modifiable risk factor. We can actually do something about blood pressure, unlike, at this point, our genes. And it turns out that many people who develop Alzheimer's disease also have prominent vascular changes in their brain. And so the contribution of those vascular changes in the brain may be contributing to some of the symptoms of dementia. And so by lowering or reducing vascular risk factors, diabetes, cholesterol, smoking, and of course blood pressure, we may be able to reduce the progression into dementia, whether it's due to Alzheimer's or other types.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Dr. O, as I think I mentioned earlier, I went to the University of North Carolina. That's the school that's going to beat Duke tonight in basketball, by the way. And we had a great coach, iconic coach named Dean Smith, who coached for dozens of years and always remembered every single player who ever played for him. And then in his 70s, he had routine surgery. Shortly thereafter, he developed Alzheimer's, which ultimately proved fatal. Can you talk to us about this interaction that we sometimes see between surgical intervention on the one hand and brain deterioration on the other?
Sure. So about 19 million Americans 65 and over undergo surgery every year in the United States. And I do want to emphasize that for the most part, everybody does very well afterwards. But what I've been seeing in the past several years in my memory clinic is that a lot of older adults are coming to my clinic after undergoing surgery and noticing that their cognitive function is not as good as it was before the surgery. And sometimes the patients themselves initiate the visit, but a lot of times it's the family members who notice that, you know, something right after the surgery happened, they were a little bit confused. We just thought it was maybe the medication, like pain medication, but it never really went back to baseline. So that kind of became a really interesting clinical question as well as a research question for me. Recently, we completed a biomarker study. In this case, we looked at cerebrospinal fluid of patients who underwent hip fracture repair. So these are patients who were repeatedly falling at home and finally broke their hip and underwent hip fracture repair surgery. And what we found was that preoperatively, these patients who were completely cognitively normal, at least by our assessment, when we looked at biomarkers of cerebrospinal fluid, so this is the fluid that bathes your brain, and looked at Alzheimer's disease biomarkers, astounding 80% of these patients who were normal had Alzheimer's disease biomarkers that were consistent with somebody who were clinically demented. So sometimes we refer to them as asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease, or they're in preclinical stages of Alzheimer's disease. So what I'm thinking or hypothesizing is that, so these are patients who are normal, but had underlying Alzheimer's disease pathology. And they undergo surgery and have anesthesia, and perhaps that might act as an insult to the brain and precipitate a cognitive decline. So obviously that's a line of research and not proven yet, but there are a lot of investigators looking at this. But I think in this case, once again, even a surgical setting, I think biomarkers play a very important role in figuring out how do we prevent the cognitive decline after surgery, and what do we do once they develop it in terms of treatment.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Abbott, let's follow up on your last answer where you told us it's very important to use your mental faculties to stay sharp. So I have bought Plato's Apology. I'm reading it in the original Greek. I'm only on page 2, so I don't know yet what he's apologizing for. But should I be reading Greek all day, or does my physical condition also come into play in trying to prevent the onset of illness?
Reading Greek and not too much basketball.
So you should be reading Greek on your stationary bicycle. So the reason I say that is that one of the big surprises that we've had in the last couple of decades is our understanding of the relationship between physical activity and maintenance of cognitive ability. There was a study conducted maybe 20 some odd years ago by the MacArthur Research Network on Successful Aging, and they measured a whole bunch of things in people in the community and then looked to see what was related to maintenance of mental ability years later. And one of the primary findings was that people who were more physically active were more likely to maintain their mental abilities. And that spawned a whole series of extensive studies all around the world, some of which involved people and some of which involved animals. And the studies with people put individuals in randomized clinical trials where some of them were physically active and some of them weren't. And then they measured their cognitive function and they measured their brain structure and function. And there are clear relationships. So if people were more likely to be doing exercises that were stretching and were, they were much more likely over time to show changes in cognitive function, improvements in cognitive function, and improvements in brain structure and function. But we didn't understand what that meant, where it was coming from. You could see that there were these relationships, but we didn't know the biology of them. And that's where the animal studies come from. So if you put animals in a wheel where they run around or in an enriched environment and then look at their brains afterwards, what you could see, the most reliable finding, was that a particular substance called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a big word for something that stands for a substance we know protects and repairs the brain. And this tends to be increased in animals that are physically active. So at the moment, our hypothesis is that this is one of the major mechanisms, as well as increasing blood flow. And that's why we think that people should be more physically active. But of course, we know that it's hard to maintain that. So you can read the Iliad on your stationary bicycle. And for other people, if they like walking, if they like swimming, whatever it is, the important thing is to do something that you enjoy and to maintain it over time, because it really might make a difference.
So Kostas, I've been riding my bike. I've been reading my Greek, doing everything I should, and yet still I feel that certain facts are slipping away from me. I can't grasp them like I used to. One of the lessons we certainly learned from the Aldens was not to put your head in the sand, that early intervention and treatment is the way to go. So when I come in to see you or someone like you on that first occasion, and we know it won't be the only occasion because this is obviously an ongoing course of treatment and care, what type of expectations should the patients develop as they enter the treatment phase?
Charlie, this is a very important point. I'm actually very glad you're bringing it up. I think there are 3 expectations. One is to do a correct assessment and get the diagnosis right. So in your particular case, Charlie, I'd be particularly worried about your being a worried well person and that there's really nothing wrong. And we actually have a lot of folks like that who come in maybe in their 60s or early 70s, and they're really worried. Maybe they had a parent with Alzheimer's disease, and we test them and we rule it out and we say you're fine. So on the other hand is the extreme with the Aldens, where we go down the entire path. We do the clinical assessment. If indicated, we do the PET scans or some of the other biomarker tests, and we get the diagnosis right. So that's number one. Expect them to do the right assessment, get it right. Number 2 is disclosure. It's remarkable to me that still in 2018, I see patients who've been evaluated elsewhere, had all the right tests, but nobody sat down and told them the results. So we have folks who come in after the follow-up assessment, they're given a prescription for Aricept or something like that and sent on their way with really no understanding of what's the diagnosis, how was it made, and what does it mean. And that conversation is really very important. So proper disclosure, proper understanding of prognosis, treatment options, and so forth. And then number 3, as you pointed out, as the Aldens illustrate, at some point this then initiates an ongoing relationship with a clinical team that needs to be by you through the course of your illness. It could be a primary care physician, which is the vast majority of the time, or a specialist team such as ours. So providing that ongoing care and support is an essential part to what the expectation should be. It should never be diagnose and adios.
Okay, thank you. And Kostas, I have to tell you, I did not like your first answer to the first question, devastating, but I really did like Dr. MacArthur's answer of hopeful. So I want to end this on a hopeful note by asking each of you the same question, which is, when you think about Alzheimer's and when you think about this area, what makes you hopeful?
So I'm hopeful. Actually, I'm going to pick up on Mr. Alden's comment, and it was a great phrase, and it illustrates what Hopkins and other great academic centers are, the nexus between great science and great care. And one of the things that I'm hopeful about is that we're getting closer to understanding some of the mechanisms. So one of the points of nexus is how neuroscience informs neurology and psychiatry to provide better care. In this audience, we have Paul Worley, who's from our Department of Neuroscience, and he and his colleagues are working on a new mechanism that may be particularly helpful when we think of new therapies. So when I look at you, the first time I met you, your face triggered a change in my brain.
Was this fight or flight, or what was...
No, because we lay down memories by actually having a structural change in our brain. The connections between nerve cells are called synapses. When those synapses are strengthened, the memory that relates to your face or anyone else's face is actually formed within the brain in a structural plastic change. And Paul Worley and his colleagues have identified some of the gene and gene products that govern that synaptic change. So if we're able to identify that, modify it in people who are beginning early stages of Alzheimer's, this may be in a new effective treatment. So just one example of a hopeful, forward-looking movement.
Thank you. Dr. Rowe.
Charlie, I'm hopeful because with the biomarkers, I think it will have a better target engagement and treatment. Hopefully the discovery of new treatment would be improving pretty soon. But I'm also very hopeful because I feel that we have not forgotten the patients who already have dementia at this point. One of the things that I want to point out is that at Hopkins, we have a lot of programs that emphasize care at home, such as the Mind at Home program that Dr. Quincy Samus and Dr. Laquetzos have been working on, where we provide care coordination so that actually the patients who already have dementia are living at home are actually getting the care that they need. So I feel very hopeful about that.
Doctor.
So as you know, I said opportunity.
Oh, you were hopeful. Oh.
And the reason I did is because I do believe that this is a remarkable moment in the evolution of our understanding of Alzheimer's disease and the opportunity to treat it. Some of you who are in this audience who were physicians in the 1950s might remember that you were taught that Alzheimer's disease was so rare that you might never see a case of it. Right? So our understanding of that disease, that it was a common disease, developed in the late 1970s. And so this is really the modern era of Alzheimer research, starting in about 1980. And we've learned an enormous amount, and you've been hearing about some of the things that we've learned and how important we think biomarkers are and how important we think early diagnosis is. And I believe that at a great institution where you have not only people with all the skills represented here, but biomedical engineers, fundamental neuroscientists, radiologists, all working together, we will find better treatments for the disease.
Dr. Albert, I'm glad you had that opportunity to be hopeful. So, Costas.
So I want to build on what Marilyn just said, and for me it's about collaboration, is that we, I think, have successfully broken down the silos that separated us, and we are working together, as you can see, different departments, different backgrounds, not just at Hopkins, but with other institutions. So almost on a daily basis, we interact with colleagues all over the world on projects of various kinds in this field. So some people are better, for example, in understanding protein unfolding. Others are better at developing the kinds of biomarkers that we will need in the future. But ultimately it comes down to that collaboration within and across institutions and working together for really what has to be a moonshot in solving the problem that's known as Alzheimer's.
I'm going to answer this question too. I am hopeful because we have wonderful experts at Hopkins like these four here, as well as many others who are smart and dedicated towards finding answers to this horrible, horrible disease. So as long as people in a room like this, I will be hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. We have some time for some questions. If you have one, please raise your hand, then our staff will come by. First question. We have people coming around with mics, so if you wait 1 minute. Go ahead. So the question was a little bit about hydrocephalus in alcohol and their relationship to cognitive decline.
Yeah, I'll start, and we also have Dr. Henry Brem, who's the head of neurosurgery in the audience, so if you want to find him afterwards, he's an expert on all matters neurosurgical, obviously. So hydrocephalus, as it pertains to dementia, we're really talking about a specific type of hydrocephalus, not affecting children, but affecting adults, what we call acquired hydrocephalus, meaning that those adults are not born with hydrocephalus, which is an enlargement of the CSF containing spaces deep within the brain. We don't know exactly why some adults develop hydrocephalus. It may be because of trauma, head trauma. It may be because of meningitis. But definitely some individuals will develop symptoms, dementia symptoms, that are related to hydrocephalus that is surgically treatable. We usually recognize those symptoms by the combination of cognitive dysfunction, difficulty with gait imbalance, and urinary incontinence. Those three symptoms go together. And that's why, as we've been emphasizing, the importance of accuracy in diagnosis is so key.
Anyone want to talk about alcohol use and cognitive
Sure,
decline?
I'd be happy to talk about alcohol use. It's actually a very interesting relationship. If you look at risk factor measures as to what are the major risks to either cause or prevent dementia, moderate use of alcohol is on the plus side. We got one cheer.
How about creme brulee?
Only if you rub it on your head.
People who are heavy drinkers often don't live into the age of risk. Alcoholics typically don't live into the age of risk. So the question of whether very heavy alcohol intake is directly related to dementia is somewhat unclear. But we also know that people who are alcoholics have brain injuries, they have poor nutrition, and they develop something called Wernicke-Korsakoff, which is a vitamin deficiency. So alcoholics get dementia at a higher rate, although it's not clear whether it's because they use alcohol as opposed to all the other things that go along with being an alcoholic.
We have a question right here.
Hi, I have two questions unrelated. First one is just a general information. What is the source of the name Alzheimer's? Is it a doctor's name who first discussed it and found it? Or is it a derivation of some German term? I don't know that. And the second is Lewy body disease. How does that connect to Alzheimer's or dementia?
So I'll answer the first question. I think Dr. Lyketsis will answer the second one. So there was a gentleman named Alois Alzheimer who lived in Germany, and the disease is named after him, but it's for a very interesting reason. So many people, we think that Alzheimer's disease is an ancient disease. We don't think it was, first began to appear in the early 1900s. But Dr. Alzheimer had a patient who he had seen who was relatively young, who developed progressive cognitive decline and became demented. And he was part of a group of colleagues, other scientists and physicians, who had developed a new stain that would be able to stain brain tissue, and another colleague who developed a new microscope. And those two things happened at about the same time, so that when Dr. Alzheimer's patient died, he had the idea, of course, that it was probably related to something in her brain. And so he took this new silver stain and he looked at it with a new microscope, and he saw these things that we still call by the same names. He said these look like plaques and tangles. And the plaques, we now know, contain this substance called amyloid, and the tangles contain a substance called tau. So he described this disease in 1906, and his patient was young, and so the thought was that this was a rare disease that only happened in young people. And it wasn't until the late 1970s until people realized that this pathology occurred at all ages. But it's named after him.
And I will emphasize that Dr. Alzheimer was a psychiatrist. Conscious of Freud, who was a neurologist. The Lewy body disease. So Lewy bodies refer to protein accumulations in nerve cells named by a Dr. Lewy that relate to Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, we see them in certain parts of the brain, certain part called the substantia nigra that controls movement. In Lewy body dementia, those same bodies are widespread throughout the brain, and they cause a variety of other symptoms, dementia, hallucinations, etc. It's if you then wish a related condition to Alzheimer's disease, there's a protein that accumulates that kills nerve tissue, and if that occurs in the substantia nigra alone, you get Parkinson's. If it spreads throughout the brain, you get Lewy body dementia.
Thank you for coming and explaining this. And you said that activity, people who did activities like would get less Alzheimer's. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. How about pets? Florence and I have a dog and a cat, and they would they help in this fight and to keep us alert?
Costas Amaro, you got pet. The question is, do pets help prevent cognitive decline?
So I don't think we know, but clearly they can be helpful to people who have dementia. There are a lot of wonderful paradigms where having properly trained animals come to hospitals or nursing homes or even private homes can be really helpful to people with dementia. I don't know that a particular interaction with a dog would prevent dementia, though,
So,
depending how well they help you exercise.
so Costas, actually, Dr. Roland Thorpe, the School of Public Health, actually has published some studies on pet owners. And as you can imagine, people who own pets actually walk the dogs, but not cats. So they do get more exercise. So I think there's that association.
There you go.
Hi, thank you. You talk about treatment, and you've talked about exercise and keeping your mind active, but what treatments are you talking about? Are there any kind of drug treatments? You said there's one drug on the market. Was it Aricept? What are you talking about in terms of treatment?
I can describe to you, but just basically the currently available FDA-approved medications. So there are two different types. The first one is called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and there's actually 3 different ones. They do very similar things. I kind of describe them as cousins. So basically there's a chemical called acetylcholine in our brain, which would make us a little bit think more straight, more attentive, but that kind of naturally degrades. And so this medication basically helps it stay in your brain a little bit longer by actually inhibiting that enzyme or things that actually break down that chemical. So that's the one type of medication, and that's approved by FDA for mild, so early stage to middle stage of Alzheimer's disease. And then we have another class, just one medication called memantine that is more approved for moderate to later stages. One thing that I do want to kind of talk about is frequently just kind of getting back to what Dr. Lichetso said about getting the correct diagnosis and how critical that is. Often I see patients who are just on the medication even without a proper diagnosis, because I think the misconception is that, well, it's for memory, so if you are complaining about memory loss, this couldn't possibly hurt. In fact, it does hurt because it has a lot of side effects, including the most common ones being GI symptoms like stomach aches, loose bowels. But importantly, it also works on your heart, so it causes your heart rate to go down. We know from large database studies from Canada that patients who are on this medication actually tend to have more what's called syncope or passing out, which results in hip fracture. Patients present to emergency department and get misdiagnosed with, well, you just have a slower heart rate, you need a pacemaker, when in fact it's the memory medications that's causing the slow heart rate, and the physicians are not recognize it. So these are not harmless medications, and so getting back to what Dr. Lichetso was saying is it's critical that you see a specialist, get the correct diagnosis before being put on these medications.
Yeah, the treatments we use in the Memory Center are really all about understanding the factors that accelerate dementia progression. So the factors that accelerate dementia progression are too much medicine that you don't need, improper management of your blood pressure, vulnerability to other health conditions, safety issues, driving when you shouldn't, not getting enough support at home. And there are a number of others. So it's really a package that tries to understand what are the factors in your case that will accelerate your condition, and how can we modify them to change your trajectory.
But I just would add to what everybody else has been saying. The reason that you've been hearing so much about our concern about not having other medications is that the last drug that was approved by the FDA for Alzheimer's disease was approved in 2003. And there have been hundreds of billions of dollars spent in trying to find new drugs. Now, we don't know if it's because we were unable to do it because people were treated too late, or if it was the wrong kind of medication, but all of us feel that it's urgently important to find new treatments. And there are, of course, some that look promising, but until they're approved and clearly effective, then we don't have them.
I think next question over here.
So what does the PET scan find? What's pathognomonic for Alzheimer's disease? And is that, I thought that they were targeting amyloid, but the drugs that they had that didn't succeed were targeting amyloid. So is amyloid the right target or not?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so brief introduction on what a PET scan does. So if you think of a regular CAT scan, there are x-rays running through your body that are imaged on the other side of the donut to tell you something about the body part that's being imaged. In the case of a PET scan, the radioactivity comes from within. So you're injected with a molecule that has brief radioactivity that has a certain property. In the case of the PET scans we're talking about, the property of these molecules is to go stick on amyloid in the brain for a brief period, long enough for us to measure its activity and quantify location and amount of amyloid. That's really the bottom line. The amyloid busting drugs, as I call them, that have been tried, have pretty much all been tried in folks with dementia, which is the advanced stage of the disease. And that's what Dr. Albert was pointing out. It may be too late. We're trying drugs when they're not going to work. It's like if you have congestive heart failure, very badly damaged heart organ, removing cholesterol from your arteries really doesn't change your outcome very much. So the question now is, if we use these amyloid-busting drugs in people who have a positive PET scan but no symptoms, then are we going to change the trajectory? We know the drugs we have are pretty good at removing amyloid from the brain. That's a dose. The more you give, the more effect you have on amyloid. This is what Dr. O referred to as target engagement. So we know the drugs are fairly good at hitting their target, but we don't know whether reducing the amyloid in early stages will really change the trajectory. That's why they're being tested.
I have a two-part question. First, in Alzheimer's, are we on the eve of developing a pacemaker, a brain pacemaker, to slow down the development of Alzheimer's?
Why don't you ask the second part?
And the second part, dementia, the role that hearing loss would play as our population ages in the onset of dementia with cognitive decline?
Great.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I know my colleagues will probably want to address the hearing loss, which is a great question. So in terms, I think your question was about, are we on the verge of developing a brain pacemaker? We certainly have, if you want to call them brain pacemakers, we call them deep brain stimulators that are now pretty widely used by our neurosurgical colleagues for treating certain types of Parkinson's, where the Parkinson's has, if you will, escaped the positive effects of medications, certain types of tremor, for example, essential tremor, and even certain types of very treatment refractory, difficult to treat depression. And Costas has been involved in a national trial of a deep brain stimulator for Alzheimer's disease. I don't know if we're on the verge of using those, but I would say that your question points out that neurology, neurosurgery, in fact, all of our fields are very interested in developing neuromodulatory therapies. These are non-pharmacological ways of affecting the brain function. Electrical stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation. They may not even require invasive procedures to do them. So I think we're definitely on the verge of neuromodulatory therapy, perhaps not on the verge of a brain pacemaker for Alzheimer's.
And we want to talk about hearing loss. And
So I thank you for asking about hearing loss. So the latest report that was published in a very prestigious journal of Lancet was that hearing loss is one of the largest modifiable risk factor for new occurrence of dementia, as much as high blood pressure and more than obesity and other risk factors. And one of our ENT otolaryngology colleague, Dr. Frank Lin, has shown that if you have mild, moderate, severe hearing loss, and especially if you have severe hearing loss, you're at a much higher risk for developing dementia, even adjusted for your age, your gender, your race, and everything else. So one of the things that actually I think Dr. Albert and Dr. Lin are working on is the new grant called Achieve. It's a grant that actually is trying to see in a randomized controlled trial whether providing hearing aids before patients develop cognitive impairment would be helpful in actually preventing dementia. So I know a lot of people are very hesitant to wear hearing aids. I'm a geriatrician, so I know. But if you need, if you have some hearing loss, if you think you have hearing loss, I would definitely recommend that you get evaluation. And if somebody tells you to wear hearing aids, please wear them.
Great. So I apologize, but we're going to be out of time to ask more questions. The experts are going to stay up here after, and you can ask questions. However, we do have the next stage in this afternoon, which is medical simulations. So for us, when we teach our young physicians or students how to do things, we now have simulation labs where the students and residents learn how to do things. And we're going to let the audience today participate. And you can become medical students for the afternoon. So we have 5 stations with our faculty, actually the faculty that teach our students and residents here today to teach people in the audience how to do things like perform CPR, inject drugs, put a tracheostomy on a baby. And you're all welcome to participate and learn from our teachers. We also have a reception. The stations are right behind us, so if you make your way out, both the reception is back there with goodies, food, and also our simulation. So could we give our panel a great hand? And thanks everyone again for coming out this afternoon. It was a great session. Thank you all.